now we have organisations setting up groups of academies who are willing to talk to the unions about national agreements, such as United Learning Trust, which is one of the few where we do have a national agreement with them. We have seen cuts in core conditions such as annual leave, sick pay, and staff being expected to work longer hours for no additional pay. Another key issue for us is that although TUPE applies to staff who have transferred over from a local authority school to an academy, we have a thing called the Code of Good Practice, which is sometimes known as the two-tier workforce agreement. Some of you may have heard of it. And what this is meant to do is say that when staff transfer from a local authority to another organisation and take their conditions with them, any new staff employed by that organisation should be employed on terms no less favourable than those of the staff who have transferred over from the local authority. It takes close monitoring to make sure it happens, but the government have said it doesn't apply to academies. We cannot see any rationale for this whatsoever. They are wholly maintained schools. They are part of the maintained sector. We cannot see why this. So we are taking legal advice to see if we can actually challenge this. So there are differences in academies. And I just give a small story about what happened with one of my colleagues who was negotiating with United Learning Trust. And we were negotiating and trying to get improved maternity and parental rights agreement with them. And she decided to just throw in something about time off and facilities for breastfeeding mothers. And the industrial relations, the person who was negotiating from ULT, was absolutely shocked and recoiled in horror and said, "I couldn't possibly put that to Sir Ewan. Not any circumstance could we discuss that with Sir Ewan." So I'm not sure what Sir Ewan's family circumstances are, but he's easily shocked. Too often, I think, as unions, we're seen as merely protecting our members' interests at the expense of the public interest. And actually, this isn't the case here, because although I've given you some of these examples, I haven't actually come here to give you horror stories of what it's like for our members working in academies. Because quite frankly, there's lots of horror stories out there for our members who work in all sorts of schools, whether they're in part of local government or the foundation or voluntary aided. They don't always treat our members very well. And even the fact that academies can set their own pay and conditions isn't a shock to us, because 40% of schools in England which are self-governing, that is the foundation of voluntary aided schools, can already do that. And in many cases do that. They do actually set their own pay and conditions. So we're used to this. For our members, we don't like it, but we're used to it. The government says it's too early to judge. That's always what we say. They still keep coming back to this. It's too early. There's not enough evidence out there. Clearly it's not. We know that there are good academies and there are bad academies, just as there are for other types of schools. But academies are more remote, they're less accountable to their communities. There's lots of evidence about some of them actually having a detrimental impact on other local schools. And the key thing is that other people will be saying today, they're hugely expensive and they are absolutely not value for money. The Academies programme has been a very costly experiment, and that's exactly what it is, a costly experiment. And we, along with the TUC and the other affiliated unions, have been calling for a complete and thorough review, taking an objective look at the evidence that's out there for academies. I have to say we're deeply disappointed that Gordon Brown, Ed Balls and his team seem determined to plough on with this policy regardless, even although there has been a change in emphasis in terms of who can become the sponsors of an academy. But just a word of warning around that. We do now have local authorities sponsoring academies, and that's great as far as we're concerned, because, I mean, what was wrong with local authorities running schools anyway in the first place if we didn't put them back to giving them academies? But also there's the move towards encouraging colleges and universities to become sponsors of academies. Now that might sound good because they're in education, they're seen as, well, sort of part of the public sector. But I have to say, as a union also organises members in the HE and the higher education and further education sector, I have to say, beware. Higher education is industrial relations variable, very variable. The FE sector, some of you may have experience of either working in the sector or being governors in FE colleges, I have to say in my experiences, over 20 years as a full-time union official, they are without doubt the worst employers I have ever had to deal with. They see themselves in many instances as little empires. You know, the principal will see themselves as having total control over everything to do with the staff in their college. And obviously there are some good exceptions to this, but by and large, it is not a sector I would want to see coming into our schools. We're committed to continuing to work with local communities to oppose academies where they're being set up. We're committed to working with other unions and organisations like the Anti-Academies Alliance, not just to oppose academies, but to expose the weaknesses in the arguments for setting them up in the first place. So we'll be happy to continue working with all of you, as I'm sure many of us, as I'm sure many UNISON branches are doing at the moment in lots of local areas. And that's really the message I wanted to bring today, is keep up the good work.